So have you ever been in a situation where for a fairly prolonged period of time, maybe at a job, maybe on a trip, maybe in a classroom, you had to be around some people who irked you, or who frustrated you to no end, or maybe someone who was just always negative? Have you been around folks that are just always negative, or just sort of suck the oxygen out of a room? Or the polar opposite, what about the person who is just so sweet you wonder if they're completely out of touch with the world? And all kinds of people and everything in between. Have you ever been with folks that kind of rubbed you the wrong way? Have you ever wondered why Jesus chose the people he chose as his disciples? I have. What a motley crew. It was a team of rivals. Why do you do that? You got Simon the Zealot. See, the Zealots were a group of people who were sworn enemies of the Roman Empire. And before Simon the Zealot started traveling with Jesus, it's very likely that he carried a knife with him, an assassin's knife. Zealots were ancient terrorists. Jesus picked Simon the Zealot. Contrast that with Levi, Matthew, who was a tax collector. Now, as though a tax collector wouldn't be enough to be despised, he's a Jew working for the Romans, collecting your taxes. Can you imagine how Simon the Zealot felt towards Levi? Talk about being irked for 3 years. And then what about Peter with bravado, boldness, and James and John, whose personalities were so strong that Jesus nicknamed them sons of thunder? And then you've got Nathanael, in whom was no guile. So you've got Peter with his bravado, and Nathanael just sort of speaking it how it is. And you've got Thomas the skeptic, and you've got Andrew, who's laid back and deferential to others. And yet this group of 12 have to be together day in, day out, 24/7, with all these personalities that rub each other. Why would Jesus do that? We tend to want to be around people who are the same, to make us feel comfortable. I grew up in a little rural town in southeastern Iowa. I know all about the farmers gathering in the coffee shops, and they're with their little group, and they've got certain time slots that they fill. If it's a Casey's or something, there's a 5 o'clock shift, there's a 7 o'clock shift, there's different ones who will get it, and there's a group of 5 or 6, whatever shift you go in on. And they've got their hats on, and when you walk in the door, if you're not from that town, they look at you like a cow at a new gate. And you know you're an outsider, you're not one of them, right? They feel comfortable in their group, and so we look for groups that make us feel comfortable. And Jesus picks a group exactly the opposite of that. People who would naturally feel kind of uncomfortable with each other. Why would you do that? They had one single purpose that was the same. They had all been called by Jesus into his mission. Come and follow me. That's what held them together. Till the end of Judas, of course. But that's what held them together. For 3.5 years, the one thing that brought them all together was their singularity of purpose in following Jesus. We've been talking the last several weeks about the church at Philippi. And think about the diversity there. Think about the composition of that church, what it's made up of. We've got 3 of the main characters we know who were likely a part of the church, because we know it from the book of Acts. You have Lydia, who was a wealthy woman. Let's call her a businesswoman. In today's era, she might be a CEO. We don't know, but she was a businesswoman, and we know she was wealthy, and she was a God seeker. And the church, after her conversion, she was the first European convert, met in her house. That's where the church was, in her house. To the Apostle Paul's ministry. So we have Lydia, the wealthy God seeker. We have a slave girl. I'm going to give her a name. Let's call her Delilah. Her name, seems to suit because she was a slave girl, she was a psychic, had a demon working in her life, and Jesus delivered her through the Apostle Paul. And so likely she's a part of this church. And I'm thinking that Delilah would be very interested in the disenfranchised. The border kids would be her thing. And she would be really interested in that. And she would bring her life filter as she's thinking about following Jesus. She's thinking about following Jesus through her empathy for the disenfranchised. You've got a jailer. A jailer was a blue-collar guy. And let's give him the name Warden. So we've got Lydia, Delilah, and Warden. And as a jailer guy, a blue-collar worker, maybe he, if he were modernized, maybe he would be a labor union lobbyist or something. He's interested in the middle-class guy, the blue-collar worker, getting a decent living wage with some decent benefits. That's the filter through which he looks at life. Well, these three represent broader categories that would have made up the church at Philippi. And though all of the people wanted to follow Jesus, Paul anticipated, and his letter implies to us, that there was some brewing strife. There was a bit of a leadership vacuum, and there was some tension happening amongst the people. Jesus had dealt with similar tensions. Paul must have known that. Because Jesus took this team of rivals of his, and on that eventful night, as they reclined at the table, and he broke bread with them and served them the wine. This is my body, this is my blood. John's gospel gives us this beautiful picture that after he did that, Jesus took a towel and a basin of water, and he knelt at their feet, and he washed the disciples' feet. Simon, Peter with bravado. Simon the Zealot, once a knife-carrying assassin. Nathaniel, clear-cut, precise. Thomas, ever the skeptic. Andrew, laid back. John and James, sons of thunder. It didn't matter. Each one with their diversity were all called to follow Jesus. And he washed their feet. And then he said in the 13th chapter, the 14th verse, I've done this, says your Lord and your teacher, so that you would see by my example, if I've done it for you, you should do it for each other. Paul was trying to teach the church at Philippi what it means to wash each other's feet, metaphorically. And so in the passage of Scripture that we look at today, bear in mind that he is endeavoring to get a diverse group of people to come together in harmony around the singular purpose of being a Jesus follower. He says this. He begins with common ground for all of us who have chosen to follow Christ. He says, is there any encouragement for belonging to Christ? Have you ever felt encouraged? Maybe in your small group, maybe at a church service, maybe at a camp, maybe just being alone with God or walking outdoors or a special time. Have you ever felt encouraged? Yeah. Any comfort from his love? Who in this room has not at one time or another felt the comfort of God's love? Any fellowship together in the Spirit? Are your hearts tender and compassionate? So he's naming for us common things that all of us have experienced. And then he says, then complete my joy by being like-minded. In other words, center on what you have in common. You all have a central purpose of following Jesus. Like-minded, loving one another, working together with one mind and purpose. Just like the disciples who followed Jesus, center on the purpose that you have of following Jesus in mission with Jesus. And then he says this in verse 3, do nothing out of selfish ambition. So he moves us from our purpose, which is to follow Jesus in his mission, to laying down that which is the greatest obstacle to living in community together, which is selfishness. So he says basically sacrifice selfish ambition. Do nothing out of it. Let that go. Don't try to impress others. Be humble. And that comes from the word humus. And we get our word topsoil from that. It's the several inches of organic soil that comes from organic things rather than have decayed, creates topsoil, and that's the word humble. In other words, out of dying to selfish ambition, out of that springs forth this life, this fertile soul and heart Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interest, but take an interest in others too. I think without those last statements, be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves, and consider others' interests, Paul is telling them, learn to wash one another's feet. In other words, approach people as a servant. I'm talking in this lesson about the dynamic of community, what I've chosen to call transforming community. Transforming, the idea of being formed by something beyond us. Community is the Greek word koinonia. We get our word communion, we get our word fellowship, we get our word participation from it. It means common union with. And so we are formed together as we are formed by something beyond us, by God's Spirit, into a common unity in Christ. Now, in the book, The Different Drum, the author tells us that community, as powerful as it is pretty hard to achieve sometimes. I want to give you just some quick thoughts, some are my own, some are his, integration of the two, as I've lived in and out of community all my life at different levels. He said that most small groups, churches are not different from this. Most small groups, he says, function at a pseudo level of community. Now, that's not always a bad thing. Pseudo can mean false, but what he really means is don't confuse it with transforming levels of community in your small group or otherwise. In other words, in this type of pseudo-community, we just are around people who are nice. We're agreeable, we like being around them, and we need that kind of community. Sometimes it's life-giving, and it doesn't mean we're not growing in pseudo-level community. It just means we can't confuse it with something deeper. Because there are times we just need to come together with a group, no demands, we just want to feel chill, and we just want to enjoy it, and just have some fun, and have some laughs, and go home, and, watch the Packers play. That's pseudo-community. It's not bad, it makes us feel good, it has a place, and it gives us a place of feeling wanted and cared for at some level. The problem is, when we start going deeper than that, he suggests that almost every group, to get to a deeper place, has to go through some level of disharmony, disagreement. And it's not unlike husbands and wives. The first year of relationships, oftentimes there's that sense of, he meets my needs, she meets all of my needs, it's wonderful, life is great. And those of us who've been married a while are looking at each other thinking, boy, is there a bomb coming someday? It doesn't always work that way. And what happens eventually is he disagrees with her, she disagrees with him, and at first they try to keep it nice. Oh, but honey, don't you think this? And yeah, but I think we would like it better if we could just do this. And pretty soon the plastic begins to melt and the boxing gloves come out. And at this point of disharmony, it doesn't usually take on that dramatic of an effect in small groups, but there's a rub. Someone dares to become really honest about something. Maybe they confess something and people are really kind of blown away or uncomfortable with that. Or someone challenges someone else and it hits a nerve and there's some disharmony. There's some disagreement. He said this is a really critical time in building community because you have different things that happen. You've got in almost every group peacemakers. And they want to, let's keep the peace, let's just all get along. And what they're doing is really trying to drive the group back to pseudo-community where everyone can just sort of feel agreeable and good about themselves. And then you've got some who are going to try to convert the other to their way of thinking or bring healing to that person or fix the problem. And you've got some who, when they start feeling tension, I'm out of here. I'm just not going to stay in this group. I've got enough tension at work. I don't want to have tension in this small group. Here's the image that I think of when I think about this. Imagine a small group of people in Christian small group together. They're in the hospital and they're convalescing together, and they all have bandages on different parts of infected areas of their body. And they're in small group together, and they really like each other, and everyone's agreeable. And then someone says, why don't we start taking our bandages off and get to the infection? And you've got all kinds of different reactions. Oh, no. I don't do that. Don't do that. You've got some people say, let's keep our bandages on. No one get nervous. Let's just enjoy each other's company. Well, the reality is, until you get the bandages off and get to the infection, you can't have really deep healing. It's all just pseudo community. So the idea is you have to start venturing into some territory where you're exposing wounds, hurts, because all of us are broken. All of us have infected areas in our lives. And real community, powerful, transforming community, is where the Peters and the James and Johns and the Nathaniels and the Andrews and the Simon Zealots and the Levis can begin to trust each other enough to expose their bandages and say, I'm infected here, I'm hurting here. And you start to, in effect, bring healing within the body of Christ. But the author says that just doesn't happen very often because it takes a lot of spiritual energy and work to do that. And it's too easy just to say, I'll just go to another group where we can leave our bandages on and just enjoy a good time and go and watch the basketball play. He said to get from disharmony to community, transforming community, you have to go through what he calls emptying. I rather like the word surrender. And that is you're surrendering your need to always have the last word. You're surrendering your need to be right or to have everyone think the way you think. You're surrendering your need to have your ego stroke and that it becomes okay for two people to disagree on something and still like each other. I don't have to make you fit into my mold. I don't have to make your relationship with Jesus be what my relationship is because we're approaching it from different backgrounds. And I start surrendering to the work of God's grace that's wanting to work in the midst of us and in the midst of our diversity. And that moves us to a place of experiencing transforming community, life-altering community. My son, Michael, has been a part of a lot of different small groups. And I was asking him recently, I said, so what's the small group, because they've been in different churches over the years, what's a small group that has had the most impact on you? He said, that's an easy one. And so in this next slide, he talked about some things. He had the privilege, he would say, to be in a small group with Jake Sullivan. Some of you will know that name because Jake Sullivan played for the Iowa State Cyclones back in late 1900s, early 2000s, something like that. And so my son Michael was in a group of other men with Jake Sullivan for a number of months. He said that was the most transforming small group he'd ever been a part of. So as he talked, I began to take note of what the dynamics were. What made this group so special that it stretched you beyond your comfort zone, but that was okay. And one of the things I was hearing was it was a place of compassion. Our small groups have to be a place where people know that whatever is said is out of love. And there's empathy, and there's love, and there's care for each other. And so this small group was a place of genuine felt compassion for one another. There was also honesty, candor, where they could just be pretty blunt with each other. And they could even challenge each other. Why would you do that? What was your thought when you did that? When you wrote that on Facebook and used that language, did you ever think about how your witness might affect someone else? Or maybe a negative about how they would think about Jesus? They would challenge each other. In fact, he said, Jake would send out these little things throughout the week, and one of the things they would think about and come back and talk about in a small group, he said, was, when this week did you shy away from sharing about Jesus with someone? When you had an opportunity, when did you shy away? He said, because I was so aware of this, and I knew people were going to ask in the small group about how your week was, and did you have a chance to share Jesus, he said he had carpet cleaners come. And he just said, I got this unction, I've got to tell them about Jesus. And so he said, I said, well, how did you do that? He said, I just said, do you know Jesus? Oh, real smooth way to just ease into it, right? But he said, actually, they were pretty cool with it. And so he talked to them about Jesus. He said, I would have never, ever done that had I known, if I didn't have a group that was going to ask me about it, that was going to pray with me over it, and that stretched me, that encouraged me to step out of my comfort zone. That's transforming community. Confession. He said there were all kinds of things confessed in the confidential atmosphere of that small group. People confess things. People have struggles with life. And if you don't feel like you've got a safe place to share it, you just tend to keep it in here. And I learned a long time ago, 36 years of pastoring, beloved, I've learned that the devil does most of his work in the dark. That when something finally is brought out and exposed, it's 95% of the battle, just getting it into the light. Because the light heals and cures. And then the underlying thing of all of this, I heard from him, was commitment. They weren't just going to walk away. See, if there's a group that someone is always by innuendo or threatening, I'm going to leave if this group does this, then you lose honesty. In relationships, and between husbands and wives, the minute someone starts saying that, oh, I'm going to leave if this, then you lose the ability to be totally honest. And lots of relationships can never be completely candid with each other because of the meltdown of what might happen if. And small groups are not exempt from that. Compassion, candor, challenge, confession, commitment. I'm going to stick it out. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be present in our small groups. I'm going to be in and out all the time. I'm going to be committed. I'm all in no matter what happens in this small group because we're committed to each other. That's a tough thing. And you can see why most communities stay at pseudo-community. That's a lot of work. But the trade-off and the payoff, when you have a son say, it's the most life-altering experience I ever had, that's pretty powerful. So I want to close with this question, how do we wash one another's feet? And I'm talking metaphorically primarily. Sometimes literally we need to wash each other's feet. But I was in band most of my life. And we got this trumpet, this little cornet from my dad when he was dying of lung cancer. And because he couldn't hold the trumpet anymore, put too much weight on his lungs, and so we bought it so he could hold it like this. And he still played in bands. And but from the time I was in 4th grade until 2 years after high school, I played the trumpet. And I was never as good as Dad, but I was pretty good. I was a pretty good trumpet player. And I was a lousy sight reader. Scott, I never could, a new piece of music I was rotten with. But once I could hear it, I was great. I could read music, but just a lousy sight reader. And so, in fact, I had a good buddy in school who sat second chair to my first. And he was an excellent sight reader. And so, when we would come to a hard piece of that first time we went through it, a really hard section, that's when I would blow the spit out of my valve. And that way I could listen. Let my buddy play it, and I could hear it, and I would play. And so, I learned something in band all those years, that something happens. I do have a mouthpiece, I'm just not putting it in. I don't want to be tempted to try to play it after all these years, because it would be lousy. I learned something. That when you're on the same page, when you're in sync, when you're following the conductor's cues, something happens in a band that's electric. And I don't know what it is except it's synergy. That we become greater than the sum of our parts. That's synergy. I think that's what community in Christ is supposed to look like. When we become greater than the sum of our parts. So how do we wash one another's feet in the community of faith, in transforming communities, in small groups? I think, one, we have to bathe each other in prayer. I've so appreciated, since coming back from the mission trip to Redbud in South Dakota, so many in that group have stayed on the texting group, and it's a group of prayer warriors. And when there's something going on in those lives, it's out there. And 2 or 3 or 4 people immediately would say, I'm on it, holding you up in prayer, lifting you up. That's so powerful. We bathe each other in prayer. I think the second thing is to wash each other's feet means to speak the truth in love. It's got to be love. A word spoken at the right time, how sweet it is. You can have the right word at the wrong time in the wrong spirit, and you're just giving people a piece of your mind that you may not have much to spare. Amen? And so you've got to do it in the right way, the right spirit, but you've got to speak truth. I think the third is to be fully present, to really be present with people. That means a level of commitment, of showing up. You know, Woody Allen said 90% of life is just showing up. And sometimes people say, well, it's quality, not quantity. Yeah, but sometimes you need quantity in order to have the quality. And it's being there. It's being fully present when you're there with people and in your groups. And it's be accountable. Be accountable. That's not just holding someone else accountable. That's being open enough to let others ask you tough questions. And sometimes challenge us. And then finally, creatively serve. Not everyone needs to be served the same way. Not everyone literally needs to have their feet washed. But some do. I was at a church once, and it was the weirdest thing in some ways. There was a guy whose life God had touched, really dramatically, in the church where I was pastoring. So he came to church one day barefooted, with a suit on. I thought, uh-oh, you know, as pastors, it's got this inner dialogue going, thinking, uh-oh. And so I realized, he said, well, I think Jesus just wanted me to come with barefooted today. And then I felt like the Lord was saying, I want you to wash his feet. Oh, great. This has gone from weird to now I'm a part of weird. Okay. And so I knelt down and I washed his feet. You know, pretty neat moment. I got to tell you, a whole church full of Methodists, they all thought it was pretty weird. But it was a God moment for me. Sometimes it's literally washing the feet of someone, but a lot of times it's just creatively understanding. How can I wash your feet? How can I operate, as Paul said, with your interest in mind? And how can I be a servant of you, a love servant, a bond servant of Jesus in transforming community? Shall we pray? Father, I pray that all of us in this room, that desire to go deeper, will also be willing to sometimes endure some of the uncertainty that goes with growth, and that we will grow through discomfort into a place of remarkable healing, where we are transformed more and more in an atmosphere of love and openness and vulnerability and transparency. We give you thanks for this church at Philippi, made up of the Lydias and the Delilahs and the Wardens, who from such different backgrounds were learning to wash each other's feet, to be servants, laying down selfish ambition, and not jamming the points of their own filter, but learning each other's stories and being united by the singular purpose of being called by Jesus to walk in mission with him. Thank you for the privilege that we have of learning in your word about transforming community. In Christ's name we pray. And all of God's kids said, amen.